And today's first talk falls into two parts, basically. The first one illustrates how God is a peacemaker. Therefore, it might help us to understand what Jesus meant is that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Peacemakers are called children of God because God himself is a peacemaker. And that's going to be coming from the story of Jacob and Esau. And secondly, and slightly more obscurely, a story about Aaron, who was renowned in Jewish tradition as a peacemaker. And in that, there's going to be two different sorts of peacemaking we're going to look at. Okay, well, let's start with part number one. This is to do with Jacob and Esau. And the last we saw of this couple, this pair of twin brothers, was on a message which I gave here on the 8th of August in this year, entitled Meeting God in Surprising Places. And that was part of the Frontline series, which we were doing at the time. So there's the names, Jacob and Esau. They were twins. One was slightly older, one was slightly younger. And sometimes we call this about siblings, but they had a sharp falling out. And the Bible itself is very straightforward, transparent about recording family disagreements. The end of this one was that Esau threatened to kill his twin brother, so it is heavy grade stuff, and Jacob then ran away. And in the last sermon on Esau and Jacob, Jacob encountered God at Bethel. And then he went on to a place called Haran, a long way away from where Esau was. And you can say, in summary, that separation seemed to be a solution between these two quarreling brothers. And it can be quite a good solution, separation, when people are having difficulty with one another. As the years passed, the brothers, of course, would have learned that they actually can live perfectly happily without one another. And the question which is raised then is, would Jacob's separation from his brother, Esau, and his family become a permanent state of affairs? How long was this separation going to go on for? Well, the answer is around about 20 years. That sounds like quite a long time for you, shall we say, not to be speaking to somebody, to have fallen out with them, with all of the concerns which that raises. All the repercussions. What's the effect of this upon Jacob and Esau's mum and dad, for example? It's just very difficult, not only for the two of them, but for anybody who is close at hand. So 20 years passed, and then God, it is said in the Bible reading, intervenes in the story, and he speaks to Jacob, and he tells him that it's time to go back to his country and his relatives. Of course, there is a very large story going on at the same time as this, and it's to do with Jacob's destiny. Jacob's destiny was not to be living in Haran, but it was to be going back to his family and his home and to take his place as one of the ancestors of the people of Israel. So you could say that while the separation fixed a problem a little bit, actually it really fell short when you begin to think of what was God's plan for Jacob and for the people of Israel. And the difficulty with it, of course, is that when he was going to go home to his land and to his family, it was going to require him to meet up with his brother Esau, who he had quarreled with. And shall we just imagine that he'd had no communication with him for 20 years? So you could say then, it was God who prompted the reconciliation, this meeting up of Jacob and Esau. And that's the reason why I've called this little chapter of the talk, God the Peacemaker. And those who follow in the way of peacemaking then follow in the way of God. They shall be called children or sons of God. Well, we had a long Bible reading, but it actually is a compelling story in the Bible. And we can feel the tension, especially on Jacob's part, his anxiety, his worry, before he comes to meet with his brother, who had in the past threatened to kill him. So Jacob cleverly sends a number of peace offerings ahead to Esau. And in summary, as we read, they meet, and you can say that they reconciled, but it's only sort of. Jonathan Sacks, the late rabbi, summarized it. Jacob and Esau they meet, embrace, and go their separate ways. This is a very good summary of what went on. Jacob and Esau meet, embrace, and go their separate ways. But I'll say this, that even if their reconciliation was not thorough, it was partial, and their reunion was better than their parting. So it was a progress, we can say. It's not the end of the story. It's not as though they probably never met again, because there is a verse in the Bible, Genesis 35:29, when they seem actually to be together for perhaps one last time. And this is the verse, then Isaac, that's their father, breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of years, and his sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him. That to me is really very moving. And of course, such stuff happens when there is a family tragedy. People who otherwise weren't really on good terms with each other sometimes come back, and they are on good terms. They have to fix things because something really big, bigger than their problem, bigger than their argument, has happened. And so it is with the death of their father. So what I like about the story of Jacob and Esau, and of course many other places in Genesis, is that we are dealing with stories. It's a story which does not hide, but actually highlights human imperfections. It also shows us that reconciliation is difficult to do well. Peacemaking is difficult to do well. But you see, when they meet, they had a conversation with each other. They talk. It's all imperfect, but it's progress. And maybe you can summarize this and get some insight into the possibility of peacemaking, is that it fixes the future more than it fixes the past. It is actually quite difficult and nigh near impossible sometimes to fix the past, to go back and try to undo it or mend it in some way or pretend that it didn't happen. But I think that one of the aspects of reconciliation is it looks to the future and says, how can we live together? So it makes a new beginning. Right, let's change topics a little bit. Here's a question for you. Which is better? An imperfect reconciliation or disposable friendships? Which is better, an imperfect reconciliation or disposable friendships? Here's one quote which I found online. I thought it was very perceptive, and it gets to this issue that sometimes we can treat friends, relatives or whatever, with a consumerist mentality. What does that mean? It means you can just pick things up, change them, return them, dispose of them. And the question is, it's okay if you're buying a pair of shoes. The question is that kind of approach to life suitable for dealing with people? Here's the quote. Consumerist mentality has directly affected our relationship with others. When we are offended by another person, it is easier to discard them and acquire a new relationship than to fix the old, outdated one into which we have already invested. Unfortunately, repairing the old relationship appears to be too costly and outweighs the payoff in the eyes of the consumer. Thus, we leave a trail of broken relationships and broken people in our wake. Okay. This is to me, a very deep and wonderful quote. It's a question of, on what basis do you treat other people? Are they like basically a pair of shoes or a belt or a hat, which you can just easily put to one side and ignore it and leave it? Or actually, is there something deeper going on in our relationships with other people, which requires a different approach? So here we have two peacemakers of a sort. It's all imperfect. We have Jacob and Esau, but I will say on the basis of what Jesus taught, they are blessed when they reconcile. Blessed are the peacemakers. And here is the first meaning of the word peacemakers. It's those who have a kind of a quarrel, and actually between the two of them, they make peace. There we go. Blessed are the peacemakers. Here's part 2 of the talk, Aaron the peacemaker. And I'm going to read to you from the Bible, Psalm 133, verses 1 to 3. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It is as if the dew of Mount Hermon were falling on Mount Zion. For there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore. You see, in the middle of all of that, we have Aaron's name being mentioned. Well, they developed in Jewish tradition the idea of seeing Aaron as a peacemaker. And so he's now going to appear in this talk from me as a peacemaker between two quarreling people. He enters the situation of the quarrels of other people and tries to find peace for them. Now, the story of him being a peacemaker doesn't have a strong basis in the Hebrew Bible, but the gaps about it are filled by later Jewish tradition. And some of that tradition is really ancient. And so, for example, and here's a name, Hillel, who was a contemporary of Jesus, you can say, just slightly older than him. But they did have a slight crossover, very famous. And this is what he said. Hillel used to say, "Be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving mankind and drawing them close to the Torah," which is the teachings of Moses. There we go. So Aaron has this loving peace, pursuing peace, loving mankind. This is his kind of reputation. Now, because it doesn't have a strong biblical background and you've been reading the Bible, you say, okay, well, this is new to me. But it is actually quite an interesting take on things. Some centuries later, after Rabbi Hillel, this is what was said about, I think this must be an imaginary thing, but it tells you a little bit about what it is to become a reconciler between two arguing people. Here's the quote. When two people were fighting with one another, Aaron would go and sit next to one of them and say, "My son, look at the anguish your friend is going through. His heart is ripped apart and he is tearing at his clothes. He is saying, how can I face my old friend?" This is a great word, my old friend. "I am so ashamed. I betrayed his trust." Aaron would sit with him until his rage subsided. Then Aaron would go to the other person in the fight and say, "My son, look at the anguish your friend is going through. His heart is ripped apart and he is tearing at his clothes. He is saying, how can I face my old friend? I'm so ashamed. I betrayed his trust." Aaron would sit with him until his rage subsided. When the two people saw each other, they would embrace and kiss one another. So this is a wonderful description, basically, of the pain, like mourning, which separation brings, and the relief which comes when it is ended. Deep down, it's important to remember, deep down, probably below a superficial argumentative level or quarreling level, deep down, these two people are regarded as old friends. And even amongst old friends, there can be a falling out. Well, I say well done to Aaron, the peacemaker, for intervening and bringing two old friends back together. And again, we should bless the name of Aaron, because blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. This is a second kind of use of the word peacemaker. In closing, we go back to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who summarizes this part very well. I think Moses as the voice of truth and justice, Aaron with the people's skills to conciliate and make peace. Aaron eventually emerged in the long hindsight of tradition as the peacemaker. Peace is not the only virtue, and peacemaking not the only task of leadership, but we must never forget, when Aaron was left to lead the people of God, he made a golden calf, but never think either that a passion for truth and justice is sufficient. Moses needed an Aaron to hold the people together. In short, leadership is the capacity to hold together different temperaments, conflicting voices, and clashing values. Every leadership team needs both a Moses and an Aaron, a voice of truth and a force for peace. In conclusion, it is difficult to reconcile well, but to repair relationships is better than to treat old friends as disposable. What price reconciliation compared with what cost separation? And it is difficult to be a mediator, but it is better for an Aaron to bring people back together than for them to remain in the pain of separation from each other. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." Amen. Give it back to